Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's album review is on Can's 1971 album, Tago Mago, which is the way I've always pronounced it. I've never heard otherwise. The American in me wants to say Tago Mago, and I'm sure it's not that, so it's probably Tago Mago, especially considering this is German. So this is the band's third album, their first appearance on the channel. And I think, first of all, I think the important thing to preface is I'm more of a space rock fan than a prog rock fan, and this album is fairly krautrock and a bit of experimental. And I think there's some jazz fusion in here as well. Although I feel like a lot of times jazz fusion is a little bit more 70s, later 70s than earlier 70s, but you can't deny the experimentalism in here and considering all the instruments and everything in here and the way there's so many blends of genres in here, it's hard to say there isn't a jazz fusion in here of some sort. Um, when you compare this to a lot of other stuff that came out in 1971 that I've heard, this is obviously leaps ahead of a lot of stuff that came out that year. Um, it doesn't take an expert to hear that when you're listening to this album. It's almost like you leap forward to like 10, 15 years and you're listening to something like from just later in the future. I would imagine, especially at the time. The only thing that really sounds dated in the album is the guitar sounds, which I find ironic because when you consider, well, maybe it's not ironic because it's tend to be forward future music and strings and guitars and are nothing new but in 1971 and maybe electronic guitars are, but um, are fairly new still, but it's kind of ironic that guitars be the most dated thing that dated sound in here to me. Um, I there's a point where I think that experimentation can be really hard to judge, and this album is like that. It's really even harder to judge because it's more rock than electronic for me, and it really was a tough album to rate, and I had to hear it like two or three times just to felt like I got an idea of it, and I still don't really feel like I have an idea of it. I think the first time I heard this album was probably about maybe 10 or 15 years ago when I got this CD at a used CD store, and I've always been interested in over the last 20, 25 years, especially kind of getting into like krautrock and more prog rock and finding more space music since I first heard more space rock in the middle early to middle 90s. And um, I've told the story before, but I had the chance of going to a particular record store when I lived in DC when I moved there in 2004 and 2003, and there wasn't many record stores around, and this particular record store was very old, and you could tell. I mean, the owner was. I mean, he looked like a fixture. He's one of those record stores you go to and where you're just like, do you know where the new section is, or do you know where this is? Like if you tried to do that, he would just be like, just look around. Nothing's sorted, nothing's organized that well. There's a lot of stacks that just haven't even gone through yet, and there's 50 cent, 25 cent piles and piles of record, and it just takes days and days and days to get through, even to feel like you've covered it. Like I would literally be in there like at least twice a week because it wasn't a close store to me. It was probably like 30-minute drive, and I would just spend a lot of time there, and you still didn't get the idea that you really covered a lot. There was just so much stuff, and it was literally like almost every genre you could think of. It was like 70s and 80s. everything from disco to early house music to early electro and funk, and there was new wave in there. There was lots of other styles, but the one style that I really gravitated to because I had never been to a record store particularly like this that was that old feeling. Like it's a little different on the West Coast because I grew up on the West Coast, and most of the record stores were fairly new. I'm sure there was some 60s and 70s record stores that were still around for 30, 40 years at the time, but not like it is on the East Coast here, especially in. Now I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There's a place called Stan's over here in Lancaster, and that place must have been there. I mean, that place looks like a relic from the '60s. That place has had to have been there since at least the middle '70s, if not older. If I was to guess, I'd probably say late '60s. And because of that, there's just a lot of older music in there, but the good thing is not like 45s. It's not like rock music, 60s and 50s and stuff, and shellac records and stuff like that. For the most part, it was 60s, 70s, and 80s music, but it was just a lot to go through, and so it's a little different than a record store that I've normally been to. Like when I was in California, even the older record stores that were well stocked, like Amoeba, with older records, they still felt fairly upkept because of the staff was large and everything was fairly organized. And this place was like pretty much like nothing I had been to before. And one of the styles that I really gravitated toward, that I really wanted to find out more about because of what was in stock there, was your prog rock, your ambient music, your space rock, your experimental music, and odd disco, funk, and house records, and electro. And so, I that's where I found Can. That's where I found a lot of the krautrock and progressive ambient and progressive rock and ambient records that I kind of got into. And so I found this one in like about 10, 15 years ago. So I've heard it a couple of times, and it's really hard to going back to. It's really hard to rate this album. It's just there's so much going on, and there's so many changes, and it keeps you on your toes. You never know what's really going to going to come next, and even though there's fairly bit of repetition in here, you still have no idea. And even if you heard it a few times in a row, it still kind of catches you off guard. So there's definitely like a lot of changes, but then there's a lot of noodling around, but then it's also still focused. There's a lot of atmospheric things and some grooves in here. There's some sort of avant-garde classical and again some sort of jazz fusion, and there's a lot of unique sounds, and it all sounds pretty fresh and creative and exciting and different, and for that I give it a lot of credit and just how groundbreaking it is. And but then there's some points of me where it's just like the experimentation is going so far that it almost ruins the enjoyment of the album, and that's where the experimentalism and groundbreakingness of the albums like this, like it can be really just difficult to rate. And I'm sure it's taken 50 some odd years to realize, and still feels like this album is still evolving and being appreciated in America, anyways. And I'm sure in Germany it was, and other places it was probably felt a little bit more. But I'm sure through the '70s and stuff, this I live in an area that's very progressive rock heavy, and I'm sure Can got a lot of respect and attention based on what they did in the '70s and through the '70s. But it's just there's certain genres and certain music that just seems like it's just so ahead of the time that you really can't grasp what it really affected and what it really influenced, and then how groundbreaking it really is. And then so there's always that when you come into something that's this artistic. But there's also the point where you're like, well, it's how enjoyable is it? And that's where this album really kind of bumps its head against for me. It's where experimentation kind of hits the edge. It's just like right on that edge where you start to enjoy some parts. There's definitely some songs in here I like. Just to go through them, Paper House, the ups and downs are really measured, and I really like that, and it kind of eases you back into the sweet spot. The vocal is really low and tucked away, but it's surprisingly soulful, and I really like the first first half of the album is I like even more, and I gave the first song, Paper House 7. I gave it 3.5 stars. Mushrooms, I gave 3 stars. Oh yeah, I gave 3.25 stars. It reminds me a little bit of like Radiohead. The fade out is genius on this particular song. I just love the fade in. Hallelujah is my favorite song on the album. The rhythm here is amazing. Um, there's so many genres. This song hits so many genres so quickly, whether it's intentional or not. Like for example, like the drumming, it almost masks the evolution of the track that goes into then it goes into funk. It's like you're listening to it, it's like okay, and then next thing you know, it goes into like funk music, and you're just like, how did that land there? And it just kind of subliminally evolved because of the way the drumming, and you were sort of focused on other stuff. So there's a lot of good techniques in here, and evolving of sounds and things like that. And then there's some that are just switch over real quick, and just like wow, that was unusual, that was different. And sometimes it amazes, sometimes it feels like it's a little too frantic for me, and sometimes generally I like smooth music more than frantic music. But again, this is experimentalism and krautrock, so like, and that's why I like space music and ambient music a little bit more, because it evolves and sets a atmosphere, and it brings out a little bit more emotion for me, like listening, and takes me to a place, and I think of where I'd ideally like to be listening to the music, and it puts me in another like headspace of where I would be listening to this music. Where something is more rock based like this, it's more I'm intently listening, and I'm just like trying to grasp everything, and it's just like going over my head and everything like that, and at times, and then you kind of like, okay, well, I'm listening too hard. Let me just listen, without really listening, and then you sort of pick up more of the enjoyment and things like that, which is good. So it's almost like the more you focus on the music on this album, the more I think the more maybe the less enjoyment that you get out of it, which is odd because you think it would be the opposite. But for me, when I don't listen intently on it and I just played the album, which I did the third time I played it in a row, I felt like I enjoyed it a little bit more, and that could be it kind of growing on me too as well. Again, I've only heard this album a couple times, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and then I played it 3 times in a row over the past. Well, actually, three times in a row last night, and then a couple times in the last couple weeks, because I was going to review it on my last section of albums, but I didn't get to it because I felt like I needed to spend more time with it, and that was me respecting what it is and wanting to accurately, or at least I get a better grasp of it by listening to it more often and a couple more times, and I really gave it some alone time, and then the third time I really just let it play in the background and see if it did anything different, and I think that's really important in general when you're listening to music is try different atmospheres, try different speakers, try different setups, maybe play it with headphones, play it at night. There's so many different ways you can enjoy things, enjoy music. That's what I try to do, and that's why I have different stereo systems in every room that I have. I have a Bluetooth speaker in the bathroom. I have a different setup in my bedroom. I have a different music listening in my main room. I have another room. This is my sort of my CD room where I do my videos and also I watch TV. So that's why you see the surround sound, just the back speakers right there, and so I really like to enjoy to play it on different types of speakers and amplifiers, and even I got a turntable right here. So I try to have different listening stations to appreciate different music, and when you put one record on more vintage speakers than newer speakers, and you're listening to a 54-year-old album, you get a little bit more out of the album sometimes, and so that was helpful for this album as well. But going back to Hallelujah, my favorite track was 4 stars. I really enjoy this track. It was my favorite on the album. Then you have track number 5, Augmen, 3 stars. Really liked it too. My least favorite on the album, and this is kind of the track 6 called Peaking. This is what this is a good example. This song is what I'm talking about how it's just so out there and so much changing and so erratic and frantic. It makes it a really awkward album to rate, and even more so doing songs. But when I sat down and really tried to gauge this one, I felt like it was my least favorite, but I still really respect it, and I enjoy the musicianship of it and everything, and there is a lot of good stuff in here. But I feel like I'm defending my score a little bit because most people would think this is an all-time classic album, and I'm not quite there because it's just a really hard album to judge. Again, Peaking, I gave it 2.5 stars. Bring Me My Coffee or Tea. I really like the ending of the album. I give it 3.5 stars. So 22 3/4 stars divided by 7 songs is a 3.25, which gives it middle 70s, and I'm good with that score. I give it a 76 out of 100, which is right in the middle of a very good album. And I think if I could appreciate it a little bit more and it was less frantic, and maybe my score on this album will grow as I spend more time with it. Maybe it can get into the 80s, but it's just so experimental and so unique and so frantic that it's almost hard. Again, it's really hard to gauge that level of just being different. It's almost hard to explain. Um, it's just when sometimes things are just so out there. It's just really hard to rate something like this. It's just I don't know how many times I can say that, but and again, sometimes if it ruins your enjoyment for the album, I feel like it's kind of gone too far, and then you kind of tune it out a little bit because it's just like, well, okay, well, it's just you know then just randomly going just all out in different ways and stuff like that, and I'm not a big fan of like over pretentious solos and noodling to the point where like I would never be a Van Halen fan. Like I don't like Eddie Vedder. I don't like the way Eddie Van Halen plays his guitar, which is a perfect example. Like I don't, if you can play your guitar, great, that's great and all, but like to me, that might impress like a guitar player. Like for me as a listener, like I don't really care. I'm not really impressed by how many notes you can hit in 10 seconds or the changes that you play on your guitar. Like I'm as a listener, I want to listen to something that's enjoyable. Like it yeah, I guess I would maybe say the same thing about a piano player that's just going crazy on some kind of classical arrangement. That's all well and good, and it's impressive, and good for you and everything like that. You're awesome at what you do, but for me, like listening, I just don't get enjoyment about any enjoyment about 100 different notes being played in 20 seconds. It just doesn't do anything for me, and I've never been a big fan of big pretentious solos and like just that kind of just going balls to the wall and just kind of going at it. Although I appreciate the experimentalism, and there's some things in electronic music that I like that do that. But there's some things in rock music that I like doing that. But this one is it gets to the point where it does ruin a little bit of your enjoyment on it, and I really say that about track 6 and track 5 a little bit about the second half of the album. I feel like the first half of the album is a little bit easier to. There's more like Mushroom has some pop structures. Um, oh yeah, feels like a little bit like a rock experimental album, an experimental song where it doesn't necessarily go overboard. Hallelujah has some excellent rhythms and things like that, and I really that's my favorite track. But it's just kind of some of the a little bit of the first half and more of the second half. It just becomes a little bit frantic, and it's kind of and it's a long album too. Um, it's a long album to take in that much of it. It's almost like you got to do it in pieces. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Tago Mago. Just in general, I gave it a 76 out of 100. I really respect it a lot, and I always look to try to understand the origins and the history and the godfathers of some of the more avant-garde music that I like to listen to. Nowadays that I like to know where things come from and try to understand it and give those people respect for being the first ones. And certainly I do that with Can. Although this is not my favorite album of theirs, off off the ones that I've heard. And so I'll review the other albums too. I have a couple here. Their main 3 albums, in my opinion. Um, uh, yeah, Future Days and the one with the green album. Those are I feel like are the major 3 Can records. But yeah, good album, good album, good album. A difficult album to rate. I definitely appreciate the uniqueness and the playing, and it's definitely way ahead of its time. But it does hurt your enjoyment a little bit of it. It's almost perplexing to kind of listen to it and enjoy. I don't know if like when people give it like a 9 or something like that out of a 10, or I just kind of like, are they just doing it because like there's pressure to write that and um, they're not giving their thoughts? Because I would think anybody who has a little bit of feeling like it's so frantic that it makes it hard to enjoy a little bit. I mean, I would think most people would feel that. Maybe not. Maybe there's some people there, but I'd be really curious if you're a fan of this album to like hear your views on it, and I'd be more interested if you could tell me what do you think is really important, and I mean, really maybe not so much important about this album, but when does experimentalism sort of kind of creep into your enjoyment or getting a lack of enjoyment for the record because it's so unique. Like there's a lot of sound collage albums that I have that are like noise and math music and stuff like that, and sometimes they can get so rigid that um, it's very synthetic and artificial, and that's what it's meant to be, and that's fine. But there's some ones that don't, and then which I would imagine would be something around this, and you're like, okay, well, it's is how much enjoyment am I getting out of this because it's it's just so different and unique in different ways, and sometimes it's more of a band setting like this and just kind of going experimental, and sometimes it's more synthetic and more rigid with again like math music or glitch music or a lot of noise music and repetitious noise music can kind of get into that realm of kind of feeling the same way. But that's my overall thoughts on Can's Tajo Majo. curious again, what are your thoughts on this? But yeah, so thanks for listening. Have a good day.